History Holes.
Welcome back to History Holes. Part 1, The Rule of a Warlord. King Jialong's Pragmatic Reign, 1802 to 1820. After 30 years of brutal, devastating war, the Taisun Rebellion was finally crushed. In 1802, from the ashes of a century of division, a new, unified country emerged. The man who forged it, Nguyễn ascended the throne as Emperor Jialong, founding the Nguyễn dynasty, the last imperial family to rule the land. The country he now commanded stretched from the Chinese border to the Gulf of Siam, a territory never before controlled by a single Vietnamese ruler. But this unification was a fragile one. The North and South, separated by 2 centuries of war, had become 2 different worlds, and the task of stitching them together would be a monumental challenge. Jialong's first and most telling decision was where to place his capital. He chose neither the ancient northern heartland of Hanoi nor the booming southern hub of Saigon, from which he had won his victory. Instead, he established his court at Hue, the ancestral home of the Nguyễn lords. Situated on the narrow central coast, Hue was a symbol of his family's heritage, but it was geographically and politically isolated from the country's 2 main population centers. Governing the sprawling Red River and Mekong deltas from this remote palace would prove to be a persistent and perhaps fatal challenge for his dynasty. Jialong was a hardened military leader, not a bureaucratic theorist. He understood power, loyalty, and the practical realities of governing a deeply fractured nation. Rather than trying to impose a rigid, centralized system from Hue, he ruled as he had fought his wars, by delegating authority to the men he trusted most. He appointed his most capable generals as viceroys with near absolute power over the vast regions of the north and south. In Hanoi, the brilliant and educated Nguyễn was tasked with managing the old Trent domain and its proud, skeptical class of northern scholars. In the south, the formidable eunuch general Lê Văn Duệ was given control of the sprawling Mekong Delta, a wild and multicultural frontier. This system was practical, but it reinforced the very regionalism Jialong's unification was meant to overcome. To provide a single legal framework for his empire, Jialong commissioned a comprehensive new law code. The Jialong Code, promulgated in 1812, was not based on the traditional lay code of the north, but was instead heavily modeled on the law code of Qing China. This was a deliberate and powerful statement. Jialong was aligning his new dynasty with the administrative and philosophical traditions of the powerful Chinese Empire, a move intended to project order and legitimacy. But for many northerners, it was another sign that they were being ruled by a southern court with alien sensibilities. This deep cultural divide was the defining tension of Jialong's reign. The northern literati, heirs to a 1,000-year-old tradition centered on Hanoi, viewed the southern conquerors with suspicion and disdain. The era's greatest literary works capture this mood of melancholy and displacement. The poet Nguyễn Du, a northerner from a distinguished Mandarin family who served the new dynasty with a heavy heart, penned his masterpiece, The Tale of Kyo, a story filled with themes of suffering, fate, and moral compromise that resonated deeply with the anxieties of the old northern elite. At the same time, the sharp-witted poet Ho Sun Hung wrote poems that satirized the rigid Confucian patriarchy the new court espoused. Her voice was distinctly northern, defiant, and clever, a world away from the concerns of the South. Under Lê Văn Duệ, the South remained a pragmatic frontier society, a melting pot of Vietnamese, Chinese, and Khmer peoples, more focused on commerce and agriculture than on classical poetry. The new empire was a single body, but it had 2 very different hearts. Part 2, The Orthodox Emperor, Minh Mang's Centralizing Crusade, 1820 to 1841. Jialong's pragmatic, decentralized approach to governing was a product of his time, a necessary compromise for a warlord uniting a fractured kingdom. But his successor had a starkly different vision. When Jialong died in 1820, the throne passed not to his grandson, the son of the European-educated Prince Ken, but to his 4th son, who became Emperor Minh Mạng. This was no mere change in leadership, it was a profound ideological shift. Minh Mạng was brilliant, energetic, and a deeply orthodox Confucian. He saw his father's system of viceroyalties not as a practical solution, but as a dangerous source of regional power that threatened the integrity of the empire. He looked north to Cochinchina as the ultimate model of a powerful, centralized state and was determined to reshape Dynam in its image. For the first decade of his reign, Minh Mạng patiently consolidated his power, but his ultimate goal was always the dismantling of regional autonomy. The death of the powerful southern viceroy, Le Van Duit, in 1832 gave him the opportunity he needed. He immediately abolished the northern and southern viceroyalties, bringing the entire country under the direct, uncompromising control of his court at Hue. He reorganized the provincial administration, sending his own trusted officials to replace the old guard and creating a bureaucracy designed to be an extension of his own will. This was a radical break from the past, an attempt to forge a truly unified state where all authority flowed directly from the emperor. Minh Mang's crusade for uniformity was not limited to administration. He embarked on what he saw as an imperial civilizing mission to impose a single orthodox Confucian culture on all his subjects. He aggressively expanded the empire's borders, imposing direct Vietnamese administration over Cambodia and attempting to forcibly assimilate the Khmer population. He viewed the diverse cultures within his own realm with deep suspicion. He enforced Vietnamese dress codes and customs on ethnic minorities, and most notoriously, unleashed a brutal persecution of Christians. He saw their foreign faith as a direct challenge to the Confucian order, a perverse doctrine that undermined ancestral worship and, by extension, loyalty to the throne. His edicts led to the execution of missionaries and forced thousands of Vietnamese Christians to renounce their faith, creating a deep and lasting wound in the nation's social fabric. This relentless drive for control and cultural purity inevitably produced a violent backlash. In 1833, the South exploded in rebellion. Led by Le Van Khoi, an adopted son of the late Le Van Duit, the uprising was a direct response to Minh Mang's oppressive policies. It was a desperate and diverse coalition. Southern officials who had been purged from power, persecuted Christians, Chinese settlers angered by new restrictions, and northern exiles who had been banished to the south. The rebellion plunged the Mekong Delta into a bloody 2-year-long war that nearly shattered the empire. This internal chaos was compounded by a devastating and concurrent war with Siam, fought over control of the very Cambodian territory Minh Mang had sought to dominate. His dream of a perfectly ordered, centralized empire had backfired spectacularly, leaving his kingdom exhausted, deeply divided, and mired in conflict on multiple fronts. Part 3, Gathering Storms, The Reigns of Thiệu Chi and Early Tuc Duc, 1841 to 1858. The relentless, iron-fisted rule of Minh Mang left the empire powerful on paper, but exhausted in reality. His successor, Emperor Thiệu Chi, who came to the throne in 1841, inherited a kingdom stretched thin by constant warfare and simmering with the resentments of his father's harsh policies. Thiệu Chi was a more temperate and less ambitious ruler. He recognized that the empire could no longer sustain the costly occupation of Cambodia. His reign was one of strategic retreat, a pulling back from the frontiers to consolidate a fracturing core. After years of brutal back-and-forth fighting, he finally negotiated a settlement with Siam, ending direct Vietnamese rule in Cambodia and establishing a joint suzerainty. It was a pragmatic, necessary withdrawal, but it also signaled a shift. The era of aggressive expansion was over, and the era of defense was about to begin. The threat was no longer a regional rival like Siam, but a new kind of power from across the sea. French warships, initially rare visitors, became an increasingly common and menacing presence in Vietnamese waters. Their pretext was the protection of Christian missionaries, but their true intent was imperial. This new reality exploded into view in 1847 at Da Nang. A French naval squadron demanding the release of imprisoned missionaries engaged the Nguyễn dynasty's fleet. The battle was not a contest, it was a massacre. The modern, heavily armed French vessels systematically destroyed the Vietnamese ships with terrifying efficiency. For the court at Hue, this was a moment of profound shock and humiliation. It was a brutal lesson in the vast technological gap that had opened between Dynam and the West, a gap so wide that it rendered their entire military obsolete. The shadow of the French Navy now fell across the empire, a constant, undeniable threat that the court was utterly unprepared to face. Emperor Thiệu died shortly after the disaster at Da Nang, leaving the throne to his son, who reigned as Emperor Tuệ Duc. Tuệ Duc was a man of letters, a poet and a scholar deeply immersed in the Confucian classics. He was, by all accounts, intelligent and cultured, but he was also sickly, indecisive, and ill-suited to the monumental crisis he now faced. His accession was itself a product of the court's decay. The powerful Mandarin Trung Dongque, seeking a malleable ruler, manipulated the succession, ensuring Tuệ Duc was chosen over his more assertive elder brother, Hồng Bao. This act of political intrigue left a stain of illegitimacy on Tuệ Duc's reign and revealed a court paralyzed by factionalism precisely when it needed unity most. The empire Tuệ Duc inherited was crumbling from within and threatened from without. While he composed poetry and oversaw elaborate court rituals, his authority in the countryside was eroding. Resentment against Nguyễn rule, especially in the north, festered. This disillusionment reached a boiling point in the early 1850s with the rebellion of Cao Ba Quát, a brilliant but disaffected scholar who took up arms against the dynasty he saw as corrupt and inept. While royal armies marched to put down revolts, the emperor remained isolated in Hue, unable to grasp the severity of the crisis. Đà Nẵng was an empire besieged by its own people, weakening by the day, all while the French warships gathered on the horizon, preparing for the final, decisive strike. Part 4, The Fall of an Empire, The French Conquest Begins, 1858 to 1883. The storm finally broke on the last day of August 1858. A combined French and Spanish fleet, a formidable armada of steam-powered warships, sailed into the Bay of Da Nang. Their objective was clear: to force the court at Hue to end its persecution of Christians and to open the country to French influence. The opening bombardment was swift and brutal. The coastal forts, built for an older era of warfare, crumbled under the weight of modern European naval guns. But after seizing the harbor, the invaders found themselves trapped. The Vietnamese army, under the command of Nguyễn Tri Phương, refused to be drawn into a decisive battle, instead opting for a strategy of guerrilla warfare and attrition that bogged the Europeans down in a sweltering, disease-ridden stalemate. Realizing that a direct assault on the capital was impossible, the French commander, Admiral Rigaud de Genouilly, changed his strategy. In early 1859, he took the bulk of his forces south, striking at the empire's economic heartland, the Mekong Delta. The citadel of Gia Dinh, or Saigon, fell with little resistance. The French now controlled the rice bowl of Đà Nẵng, a strategic move that would choke off the empire's resources and give them a secure base from which to expand their control. For the next 3 years, the French slowly tightened their grip on the south, while the court at Hue was paralyzed by a war on two fronts. Even as they faced the invaders, massive rebellions, led by pretenders to the old Lê dynasty, were raging across the northern provinces. The empire was bleeding from both ends, its armies stretched thin and its resources dwindling. Emperor Tuệ Duc, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, was forced to sue for peace. He sent one of his most trusted mandarins, Phan Thanh Giàn, to negotiate with the French. The resulting Treaty of Saigon, signed in 1862, was a national catastrophe. Tuệ Duc was forced to cede 3 entire southern provinces to France, pay a crippling war indemnity, and formally grant freedom to Christian missionaries. For the Vietnamese court and its proud scholar officials, the treaty was a profound humiliation, the first time a Vietnamese ruler had ever signed away sovereign territory to a foreign power. The loss of the South was a wound that refused to heal. Phan Thanh Giàn led a desperate diplomatic mission to Paris in 1863, pleading with Napoleon III to return the lost provinces, but it was a futile effort. The French admirals in Saigon, now governing the new colony of Cochinchina, were determined to expand their control. In 1867, citing the court's inability to stop local resistance movements, they annexed the remaining 3 southern provinces without firing a shot. Phan Thanh Giàn, who had been appointed governor of these provinces, was now faced with an impossible choice: fight a hopeless war or collaborate with the invaders. Choosing neither, he penned a final, heartbreaking letter to his emperor, took responsibility for the loss, and committed suicide by drinking poison. It was the tragic end of a loyal mandarin and a symbol of the dynasty's utter helplessness. The Nguyễn dynasty still sat on the throne in Hue, but it was now a shadow of its former self, ruling over a truncated kingdom, its southern heartland lost forever. The conquest was far from over. The French, having secured the Mekong Delta, now turned their eyes to the Red River in the north, and the final, agonizing chapter of Dynam's independence was about to begin. And so the grand project of the Nguyễn dynasty, to build a unified Orthodox empire, found itself at a fatal impasse. Obsessed with internal purity and blinded by tradition, the court at Hue failed to see the true nature of the storm gathering from the west. The cannons at Da Nang were not just an attack. They were the sound of a new era arriving, an era the last emperors were utterly unprepared to face. The stage was now set for a full-scale conquest, a clash of worlds. I thank you very much for joining us on this journey. Please leave a like and subscribe if you want more. If you feel like it, tell us what else you'd like to hear. See you on the next episode.